Hey Joe, how's it going?
Hey,
Hey, so I just want to do a final sound check. Let's just move this to the side. And there we go. Test, test, test.
sounds good.
Yep. Test, test,
Sounds good.
test, test.
And sounds good.
Okay, good. Thank you. And we'll just do a final for this. Okay.
I heard a tap.
Okay. Test, test.
Sounds good.
Okay. Good. And
Did not hear a tap then.
okay.
No?
Okay. Test, test.
Sounds good.
Okay. Great. All right. Thank you. All right. And the lighting is about what it was?
Lighting is good. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. And we're going to start in just a few minutes. Thank you so much. Yay. Okay, Joe, I'll see you in a bit.
All right.
On Saturday, March 14th, 2020, we gave the final public performance of a play in San Francisco. There hadn't been any public performances for 2 nights. We were the last one. You see, we'd opened the show on Thursday, and there was an audience. It was before the theaters were shut that Thursday. And then on the Friday, after that first performance, I got a call from the artistic director of the theater where we were performing. She said, there are no more public performances. That's it. Tonight is canceled. Friday night is canceled. Saturday is canceled. The whole rest of the run, as far as we know, for the time being, is canceled. Well, it was devastating, of course, but I realized there was a larger issue at hand, safety. But I asked her if we could film the show so that people who wanted to come see it subsequently in the run, who couldn't because the show was canceled, could watch a taping of it. She said, yeah, if it's just you and the actors and a videographer, you can tape it. So great. Friday, I talked to the cast. They said it was fine. They had never shown a lot of anxiety about COVID. They thought, the audience packed together, that was probably dangerous, but they had no anxieties about working with each other. It was fine. As a matter of fact, one of the actors had thought it was just a lot of paranoia. He thought that the news was exaggerating everything. His father was a doctor, and he thought a lot was being made of COVID, and maybe it wasn't necessary. He said that many times. So we decided that on Saturday we would film the show. Well, on Saturday morning I got up, I went down to the Embarcadero YMCA. I swam my laps, which I love to do. And I went up to the weight room and I did my weights. I was feeling great. And then I got a call. It was the artistic director. The marketing director of the theater had told a reporter for a major newspaper that we were going to gather and tape the show so that audiences had something to watch during COVID after the shows were canceled. And this reviewer was fascinated by this, completely fascinated. She wanted to come and watch the taping of the show, interview everybody, and write a big article about moving forward in COVID, theater surviving in COVID. And I said, well, okay, it's a little bit weird because it'll just be one audience member, but if it's okay with the artistic director, it's okay with me. So I agreed to it. And I went down to the theater and we got all ready for the performance. And 10 minutes before we were supposed to begin, I was backstage behind the curtain, separating me from the audience. And the actor who had said that he thought it was all, exaggerated, that his father was a doctor, came up to me and he totally freaked out. He was totally freaked out about social distancing, about us as actors being too close to each other. He was completely wigged out about that. And he didn't know what to say to me. And I said, well, what do you want? He said, well, I can't do the play unless there's social distancing. 10 minutes before we're supposed to start the show. He said, okay, it's fine, it's fine. We just have to sort of re-block everything, right? We have to reconfigure the show. So behind the curtain, we quickly re-blocked everything. And it was really weird because this play, it had violence in it. It had punching. Now the punching would be like this. With a big gap between it. They had a lot of kissing between the guy and the girl. Now the kissing would be like this. It was weird. It took 40 minutes to reblock. Finally, we're all set to go. I thought, okay, here we go. Here's a socially distant performance for one person. And we stepped out there and we performed the entire play for one person. It was totally weird. It was like, there was like one person watching it. It was just bizarre. And of course, there was the violence and the kissing. It was just bizarre. The whole performance was strange, completely strange. But we did it, and they filmed it, and we were interviewed for the article, and we did it. The last public performance, a public of one, in San Francisco on Saturday, March 14th, 2020. Well, I went backstage afterwards, and that was it. As far as we knew, the whole rest of the run was canceled. We sat in a circle, socially distant circle. It's the first time I'd ever done anything like that. We were 8 feet apart from each other. We ate some crackers, we drank some drinks, but we didn't share anything. We didn't share bottles, nothing. We had sort of a socially distant cast party. It was weird. And I said to him, this has been great doing this show with you. And I don't know what's going to happen now. I'll be in touch. I think it's going to be 1 week, 2 weeks. It's not going to be that long. I'll be in touch every week to tell you whether or not we're going on. That's what I thought. I thought it might end in 2 weeks. Another part of me saw how people were reacting. I started realizing that I should start reacting. That maybe I was putting people in danger. And I kind of had to snap out of it. I had to start taking responsibility for mine and other people's safety. So I went home that night, got into bed with my lovely husband. The next morning, we got up early and we talked about what we were going to do. Well, first of all, we needed to shop because we really didn't have much in the house. So we went to the local supermarket, which was pretty much always empty. Nobody ever shopped there. It was a huge store, but for some reason, nobody ever shopped there. We bought some things and we bought toilet paper. Okay, yeah, we bought, you remember all that, the toilet paper craze. We bought toilet paper, we took it home, and then we decided we need to do something outside, away from people. We shouldn't be going anywhere where we're around people. So we decided to take one of our favorite hikes on Mount Sutro. Now this hike, nobody's ever on this hike. It's right in the middle of the city, so it's easy to get to, and there's never anybody on this hike, and the paths are pretty much clear. You might pass one bicyclist or something. Well, that day, the paths were packed. I couldn't believe it. Everybody had the same idea we had. An urban hike on a path that nobody ever goes on. Who knew? And it was horrible because people were like scurrying out of the way of each other and running up the side of the path and hiding behind trees and grabbing their children, protecting them from us. It was like weird. Nobody was wearing masks yet. People were just totally paranoid about each other. And I'm like, what's going on? Are we that big? We can't go down the path. I was like, oh, this is COVID. People are terrified of COVID, even on this usually deserted path, now crowded. So we went home. We shopped some more at the corner grocery. We bought some more toilet paper. We didn't have that much stuff, but we figured we could shop. We just keep shopping. We keep it steady. Next morning at 8 a.m., we got a text from a friend at City Hall. It was the inside track. At 9 a.m., the mayor was going to announce shelter in place. Stay at home. We're like, oh my God, what does that mean? Does that mean we can't do anything? And also, everybody's going to want food. So at 8:15, we rushed out the door. We got a zip car and we raced to that empty, deserted supermarket. We walked in there at 8:30. It was packed. I've never seen this many people in that supermarket, and people were frantic. We had two huge shopping carts. We were maneuvering around, throwing things into the shopping carts, grabbing anything. A lot of this food we still have because it's not even food that we eat. A lot of it's just junk or stuff that we don't like, but we were just loading up two huge shopping carts. And as it turned 9:15, it got more and more crowded. There was less and less food. A woman said to me, where are those crackers? I said, there are no more here. You can have some. I mean, it was like scary in there. We took the food home. We went out to another supermarket, Safeway. It was packed, lines going out the door, and the shelves were bare. We didn't stay there. We went to another market, a small one in the Mission, which I'd known about. I scoped out. It had a huge line, but it still had food. We loaded up. All day long, we loaded up. Food, gathering food. And then I had a thought. I thought, what if the banks fail? Banks can fail. Everybody can panic and pull their money out, and then the bank fails. What if the bank fails? Well, once we got all the stuff in the department, I said to Michael, I said, okay, I'm going to go to the bank and take out all of our savings. Now, we don't have that much money in there, but I wanted to get it out of there in case, it disappeared, in case the bank failed. So I went down to the bank, and a part of me was thinking, oh, I'm just being paranoid. Come on, this is like so dramatic. Why would the bank fail? So I went in, and I went right up to the teller, and he was like looming over me. He was huge. And he was standing there, and I said, I'd like to withdraw all my money. And he said, you can't. I said, why? He said, you can only take out half. I said, that's not the agreement. It's my money. I want all of it. He said, you can only take half the money. I said, why? He said, that comes from corporate. I said, why? Well, people are taking out their money, so we can only give them half. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I just thought I was being paranoid, but in fact, they were only giving people half of their money. It was horrible and reminded me of all these movies. I felt like I was living in a movie. First of all, every single disaster movie, Independence Day or Greenland or World War Z or the day after has the panicky scene in the supermarket. We'd already lived that, and now the banks were failing. And what this reminded me of was that movie, It's a Wonderful Life. Now, this movie's got like a bazillion great scenes in it. Well, it's not a book, obviously, I think that. I mean, it's got all these great scenes in it, but the scene that always got me, because I could not even imagine this was possible in the United States, was the run on the bank. It was amazing. People running to the bank to get their savings out at the beginning of the Depression when the banks failed and they couldn't get any money. One bank was offering 50 cents on the dollar, which is exactly what I'd gotten, half. These incredible scenes. I remember saying to my father, who lived through the Depression, I said, did this really happen? He said, oh yeah, the banks failed. They never thought everybody would come and get their money. Of course, they didn't have the money. It was all invested. Horrifying. He's actually living in a movie. So we took what we could get from the bank and we went home. And we were totally freaked out. I mean, completely freaked out at the end of that first day of shelter in place. I mean, we'd done really well with the groceries and the toilet paper and some of the money, but we were just really. So I said we should play a game, take our mind off stuff, get competitive, focus on something. So I got out the one game we had that we both loved, Scrabble. And we played Scrabble. And it really focused our energies, our competitiveness, our trying to figure out words. And for an hour, we lost ourselves in Scrabble. Although I think our state of mind is sort of revealed by the words that we came up with that night. Then I had to figure out exercise. I couldn't go to the gym anymore. The gyms were going to be closed. I had to figure out how to do everything in my apartment. I couldn't use my weights. So I had to figure out how to use my body as weight. So I figured out push-ups, something I really wasn't very good at. I hadn't been doing myself. I would use my body for push-ups, also sit-ups, which I detested. But it was my body and I could use it. Also deep knee bends, all these exercises that would use my body as weight because I didn't have it anymore. Next morning we got up and I had to figure out work because I couldn't go to work. The office was shut. We weren't supposed to be around other people, just the immediate people in our lives, right? So I would work in the mornings and the afternoons, and Michael was home. He was on leave until they figured out what they were going to do at the library. So that was sort of wonderful because in the middle of the day, we could go to Golden Gate Park, which is right near our house, and have a picnic right at the House of Flowers. It was wonderful. I never experienced that building as much as I have during COVID. It's a magical building to see it change in the seasons, to see the people gather there, the children, the adults. And what would I do about work? Everything would have to go on to Zoom. Everything would now be on Zoom. Meetings, discussions, rehearsals, even performances. I was thinking, we're going to have to do it all on Zoom. It's the only thing to do. Also, safety. We would have to start wearing masks. First, I started with an N95. Now, here's the thing about the N95. It was the mask to have, and I had landed 2 of them on that day, that first day of shelter in place, but then they started saying, it's not the mask to have. No, 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 it's not. There are problems. You should just have the old-fashioned surgical mask, right? So then I doubled the surgical mask because that was what they said to do. And finally, I was beginning to feel like I was ready. I was beginning to feel like I was ready for COVID. Okay, there was still a lot to figure out. We hadn't figured out everything, so don't get cocky, right? That's what I told myself. We had to figure out the markets. We couldn't go to those markets anymore. They were too horrifying. If I could imagine going through that horror again with, people breathing all over me, sneezing, it was too scary. So we started ordering everything from Whole Foods, and the deliveries were great, and Michael was great at it. He figured it out, and it employed people, and we could keep socially distant from everybody. We could keep apart, right? Also, I had to figure out the exercise because up till then, I had been swimming every single day and doing weights at the Embarcadero, and now it was closed. It was completely closed because of crowds. We had to figure things like this out, and we couldn't solve them by being around crowds, by being on crowded sidewalks, being in markets, exercising in crowds. We couldn't figure it out. At night, I was reading a book by Barbara Tuchman called A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century. This book was very timely because it was about the Black Death. And the Black Death was all about crowds. You had to get away from the crowds, people crowding in their homes, people crowding at shopping, at events. Wars were dangerous because look at people crowding together, fighting each other. That meant if they didn't kill each other, they give each other disease. The crowds had to be avoided at all costs. So how would we exercise? We figured out that we could bike. We could ride our bikes. That would isolate us. We'd be out with the cars away from the sidewalks and all the people. Sometimes we could pull our masks down if there are no people around. The cars, they were like bubbles. People couldn't breathe at us from cars. And we get our exercise in the city because we couldn't leave the city. It wasn't allowed. So we ride to the top of hills. We push ourselves. We started with Twin Peaks. We rode all the way to the top. And look at that. You see down here below? That's a slow street. You know what a slow street is? It means you can't. Yeah, of course. You got it. It's only bikes and pedestrians, and we slow streeted it everywhere. So now we were all set. We were figuring it out. We were figuring out how to get exercise. Also, if I wanted to swim, if I really wanted to swim, I could always swim at Aquatic Park. Yeah, I mean, the water was freezing, but what a view. Every time you breathed, the Balclutha, the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, Mount Tamalpais. It was amazing to swim there. So we embarked on our program. On the weekends, we would get as much exercise as possible. Our goal was to ride to the top of every hill in San Francisco. Now, they're either 48 or 72, depending on what you read online. Some of them are just bumps, but there are a lot of them. They're endless. We tracked them all, and we are headed to the top of every single hill on our bikes in San Francisco to get that exercise, but to still stay in the city. So we start with the hill right next to our house, Buena Vista Park, with its incredible view of the Golden Gate Bridge. Then we went to Billy Goat Hill, which has an incredible view of downtown and also has a swing, you see? And you can sit there and swing. And I actually did it. I'd never done that before. I swung as I looked at downtown San Francisco. Then we went to the top of Grand View Park. A lot of people don't know about this park. It has a great view of both the bay and the ocean with the bridge in between. And what nobody knows about it is it's actually a massive sand dune in the middle of the sunset. Look at that. That's gotta be like the biggest sand dune of all time, certainly in the middle of a city. And it has this great park on top of it. It was incredible. And then one day, the biggest adventure of all, south, 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 south all the way to Sweeney Ridge. And at the top of Sweeney Ridge, and it was so steep and so far away and so much sun beating down on us. I mean, COVID, it's been the best weather. Have you noticed that? The weather's been great. The sun hammering down on us. We had to push our bikes part of the way, but we made it. We made it to the top. And there was a plaque commemorating Portola, who come from Spain through Mexico all the way north. And this is where he first saw the bay. Now, this tied in with something that I love studying as a college history major, which was the first Great World War. This is the first truly world war on this planet. It was between the English and the Spanish in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it had come all the way to the Bay Area. Think about it. That war, that cultural conflict is written in the place names, the town names, the geographical designations of the Bay Area. Here is Point Reyes, Point of the Kings. What kings? Well, the kings in the New Testament, of course, but also the kings of Spain. It embraces Drake's Bay, right? So Point Reyes, Spanish. Drake's Bay, English. As you move through Marin, the names exchange and you hear this cultural war in the names of the towns. San Anselmo, Spanish. Inverness, English. San Rafael, Spanish. Ross, English. Across the bridge, the San Rafael Bridge to the East Bay. On the other side, you're in Richmond, English. El Cerrito, Spanish. Berkeley, English. San Leandro, Spanish. And also, the people who lost the territory were ripped off, run off their land. The indigenous peoples, their names remain too. Marin, Tamalpais. This war is written on the landscape, written there on the landscape. But why did it come here? Why were the Spanish and the English so interested in the Bay Area? Because it was the Bay Area. And they were water people, they were Navy people, and we are an area defined by water. The bay, the ocean, rivers, sloughs, swamps, marshes. This is an area of water. And how did this huge war between the Spanish and the English begin? It began with a massive battle on water, the Spanish Armada. Amazing. And here we were exploring all this history in the middle of COVID. And why was I trying to escape into history? Why this sudden desire to retreat into stories from the past? Because as COVID went on, I began to realize that there was a very strong possibility that I was going to lose my job. I couldn't think about that all the time. I had to have an escape. I had to have other things to think about. So I would often think about the Spanish Armada. Now, how did this Armada, this huge fleet, this naval battle come to be? It all started with King Henry VIII. Yeah, Henry VIII. Remember him? He wanted to divorce all those wives. He divorced 5 wives. He chopped off a couple of their heads. And the Catholic Church kept saying, no, 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 no. And he said, yes, I'm going to do it. And he was sick of the Catholic Church. So he broke England off from the rest of Europe, from the Catholic Church in the middle of the 16th century. And he created the Church of England, which didn't have the Pope at the head of it. It had the King of England himself. He made England into a Protestant country, a country of protesters, Protestants. His daughter was Mary I. Well, she was Catholic. Her mother had been Catherine of Aragon, the first wife to be at adrift, and she remained a Catholic. And she tried to revert England to Catholicism in 4 bloody years. She ruthlessly suppressed the Protestants, so much so that she became known as Bloody Mary. She also married Philip II of Spain. Now, he was the most powerful Catholic monarch on the planet, probably the most powerful monarch of all time. He was incredibly powerful. He was like a superpower in of himself. His empire stretched on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, all the way to Italy. He had influence over Germany, over France. He had colonies in the Netherlands, the Low Countries. He was fighting a war with the Dutch to get their property back because they had risen up against him. He also had a lot of North Africa. He had the Americas, North and South. He had Asian properties, the Philippines, named after him. And now he was the King of England, married to Mary. And they were ruthless on the Protestants. Well, Mary died, Bloody Mary, and she was succeeded by her half-sister, Elizabeth, a Protestant. And Elizabeth made England Protestant again. So what was Philip to do? He was angry. He wanted to protect English Catholicism, but he was no longer King of England, not at all. So he backed a rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, the Scottish queen, who was Catholic. Now, the Scots didn't like her. They didn't like the way she conducted her personal life, so they ran her out of Scotland. And she became a Harvard citizen. She was protected by Queen Elizabeth for 17 years, even though she repeatedly got in plots with Philip II to dethrone and execute Elizabeth. Finally, Elizabeth had enough of this. She had had enough. And when the final plot was exposed, she chopped off Mary, Queen of Scots' head. Also, she was completely frustrated with everything that Philip II was trying to do in her country, in England, trying to make it Catholic, always trying to influence, trying to get her killed through Mary, Queen of Scots. So she backed the Dutch Revolution against Spain. She backed the people in Holland against Philip II. Well, this pissed off Philip II. He was royally pissed. He didn't like somebody telling her what he could do. No, he was really, really annoyed. And so he would assemble a fleet. He would send that fleet north. It would pick up a massive army in Holland, the army under Parma, the Spanish army that was fighting the Dutch revolutionaries. It would transport that army to England for an invasion of England. Now, what were the relative powers? What was the relative strength of these two powers? Well, Philip II was like the United States. He was a true world power. He had his fingers in everything. He had massive navy, massive army. He had wealth from the New World. He was the man on the planet. England was like Poland. It was like Poland. It wasn't even a second-rate power. It was more like a third-rate power. And these were the forces that were coming into conflict. This was it. I kept thinking about the theater. I couldn't sleep at night. What would happen with the theater? How could it survive in all this? But I couldn't get stuck on that. I had to focus. I had to figure this out. And I kept drifting off into fantasy. The fantasy of the Spanish Armada. So what was the Spanish Armada?
It was a fleet of ships. Philip II assembled 150 ships. He put them under the command of a man named Admiral Sidonia. They were organized into a crescent shape. They always sailed in a crescent for defensive purposes. And he sent them north towards England. Where were they headed? They were headed to pick up the Spanish army that was fighting the Dutch in Holland, trying to defeat the Dutch resistance, trying to stop the Dutch from breaking off from England. 150 ships, 8,000 sailors on the ships, and 20,000 soldiers on the ships, embarked on the ships. Parma's army, the Spanish army in Holland, had another 30,000, combined 50,000. They would be unbeatable when they landed in England to conquer it. And this was the Armada. What were their tactics? How did they fight? Why did they carry 20,000 soldiers on board? Because what the Spanish believed in was not so much gunfire. Gunfire was just a precursor to a battle. That softened up the enemy. Then you bore down the enemy, grappled with the enemy, and your men went on the enemy's ship and killed all the enemy on their ship. That's how you fought a naval battle. Who were their adversaries? Their adversaries was the English fleet at Plymouth. This fleet was under the command of a man named Admiral Howard. Now, English tactics were very different from the Spanish. They didn't believe in grappling. The English believed in gunfire. Ships that were well designed, well sailed, and had a lot of punch in the gunfire. They didn't like to get close to Spanish ships. They liked to keep the Spanish ships at a distance. That way, right, they could use their cannons, and their cannons were better than the Spanish. So the Spanish were sailing north against the English. A roundabout way to pick up their army in Holland. They picked them up in the French port of Calais, but the seas were not kind. They were not kind to their armada. There were storms. There was wind. There were waves. The wind was never good. It took them 2 months to sail north along the French coast. The storms were vicious. They didn't think they'd make it. They were terrified. And the English knew that they were coming. The English were well informed. The English had a series of beacons that lined the French coast. And as the Spanish fleet sailed north, the British would light the beacons that would signal to the next beacon to signal all the way to England. As each England saw, they signaled north. Signaled north. Signaled north. Until the British knew that they were coming and they were prepared. They would sail out and they would hit the Spanish before the Spanish could hit them. That's what they would do. They would sail out and get the Spanish before the Spanish could get them. But the British didn't count on the tides. Now the wind was not nice to the Spanish, but they managed to get north. In May of 1588, they left. They didn't arrive until 2 months later, finally off of Plymouth. But the British couldn't leave the port. They were stuck there. The tides were against them. They were stuck in Plymouth. And Admiral Sidonia had his chance. What he wanted to do was sail right into Plymouth, grapple with the British, go on board and kill them. Use those 20,000 soldiers, the 20,000 soldiers. The British didn't embark any soldiers. He could go ashore. He could go on the ships. He could take over Plymouth, destroy the British fleet. But Philip II's representative said, no, you have your instructions, stick to plan. You're supposed to go to Calais and pick up the army. Don't go into Plymouth. So Admiral Sidonia didn't get what he wanted to do. He had to change course and sail for Calais. He would not be allowed to engage the English in a way that he knew would win. He turned to the right and headed for Calais. So what would happen to the theater? What would happen to the theater? I mean, how could it survive? It couldn't have audiences, so it couldn't generate any income. There was a crisis in leadership, a lack of will, We couldn't take out any loans because, loans, they require, you have to pay back loans. How would we pay it back? Suppose we didn't have any money down the line. We just go deeper and deeper into debt. We could only rely on grants and the government. That was the only thing that could save us. That was it. So now, the weather changed for the English. The tides changed and they could come out. And suddenly they were upwind of the Spanish, right where the English wanted to be. And their superior seamanship kept them behind the Spanish. Anytime a Spanish ship turned around to engage, the British would fall back. They would get out of the way. They would leave, and they shelled the Spanish fleet. It wasn't devastating, their attack on the Spanish, but it was pretty good. It kind of wore them down. Now, the Spanish always sailed in a crescent because that's how they could protect their own ships. These were not all warships that the Spanish sent. You see the crescent? Okay. On the ends of the crescent were warships. At the front of the crescent were warships. Everything in between were transport ships. Those were the transports for the army, for Parma's army in Holland. And the warships, the galleons, were there to protect the transports. You see the British fleet? Yeah. You see them? Yep, right there. British fleet. They had to hang back, but they kept nudging the Spanish, nudging them. They kept nudging them across the ocean. They kept pushing them, pushing them, pushing them. The English were persistent. And as the fleet sailed, it nipped at them. It knocked out a few ships, not a lot, but some important ones, as it nipped at the Spanish, nipped at them. The Spanish were stuck on their plan. They were sticking to plan. They wouldn't deviate from their plan. Philip II wouldn't let them. He was the most powerful monarch in the world. You couldn't say no to him. But the British were pivoting. They were pivoting. They were showing that they could seize the opportunity of the wind and the tide and pursue the Spanish and wear them down. They nudged them forward, nudged them forward, nudged them forward. So what would we do? How would we pivot as a theater? How would we pivot? Well, everything, as I said, had to go online, including the performances. We would have to perform the shows online. At first, it felt kind of sad. I was so used to being with actors on a stage, watching actors on a stage. I didn't want to do movies. I wanted to do live theater. And now we're all isolated, pretending we were talking to each other, talking to a little green light. One of us was in San Francisco, another was in Berkeley. Somebody might be in Ireland or Los Angeles or New York. We're all isolated. And at first, it felt kind of foolish. Like we were just, I don't know, fooling around. But it was live. It was live theater. We were doing it live. And it was showing the world that we were alive. That's what was important, right? That we remain alive. So, Admiral Sidonia, with the Spanish Armada, had made it to Calais. He had tried to go ashore in England. He had tried to nudge into England. His ships were worn out. He needed to go ashore. He didn't really want to invade England yet. He just wanted to get ashore. But the British always cut him off. They always nudged him away, nudged him away, nudged him away. Finally, he just made for his goal, which, as Philip II had outlined it, was, of course, Calais on the French coast. This is where he would pick up the army that would invade France. Always in the crescent, always in the crescent. And the British pursued him. And they lined their ships up outside of Calais. Well, here comes the Spanish army under Parma, 30,000 men. Enough men combined with the 20,000 on the Spanish Armada already to conquer England, to take England. They were headed, they were on their way. They weren't that far away, but the Dutch intervened. The allies of the British were there, and they intervened. And they couldn't stop Parma and his Spanish army, but they could slow it down long enough. They could slow it down long enough such that the English could do something to the Spanish Armada. What could they do? What could they do? They couldn't get the Spanish Armada to come out. Admiral Sidonia was too smart. If he came out, he'd just get blasted. He wanted to wait until he could grapple with the British. But the British, they couldn't come in because they knew they'd be grappled. So what could they do? What could they do? And the British decided to use fire ships. They would send fire ships into the port. And the fire ships would scare the Spanish out of the port of Calais, right into the guns of the British. The fire ships entered the port, but they didn't scare Admiral Sidonia. He knew about fire ships. He wasn't going to fall for that. He knew that they couldn't damage his ships that much. He wasn't going to fall for it. Here's a picture of fire ships. Yeah, you see them there? They're right there in the center. He wasn't scared by them, no. But this picture is inaccurate. Admiral Sidonia was not scared by the English fire ships, but some of his captains were, because the ships the British sent in were huge. They weren't tiny fire ships like in that other picture. They were gigantic fire ships. And worse than that, a lot of the Spanish captains thought that they were hell burners. What's a hell burner? A hell burner is a burning ship, large, which isn't just burning, it's loaded with powder, with explosives. And when those explosives blow up, they're going to flatten anything even close to that ship. And some of the more scared, inexperienced captains in the Spanish Armada thought, oh my God, here come the hell burners. There were 8 of them, and they were terrified. And a lot of those captains cut their anchors. They gave up their anchors. They threw away their anchors and sailed out of Calais. They left the harbor to get away into open sea. They were so terrified by what they thought were hell burners. And they headed off into open sea. Admiral Sidonia didn't know what to do. What was going on? He hadn't ordered this exit. He hadn't ordered people to cut their anchors, to lose their anchors, to head out in the open ocean, but there's nothing he could do. He had to keep the fleet together, because without the fleet, there could never be an invasion of England. So Admiral Sidonia ordered all of the Armada to sail out of Calais. And as they sailed away, they left the Spanish army behind, which the Dutch shadowing it, and they sailed north out of Calais. The British were being brilliant. They were being so bold. They were being so persistent. They were using their fire ships. They were using their allies. The British used their allies. These people that Elizabeth had been fighting the war with, the Dutch, they used their allies. And this inspired us at the theater. We would be bold. We would keep performing. We would be persistent. We would do stuff. We would keep out there. We would show we were alive. And we would use our allies. We would contact everybody we knew at other theaters and ask them, what's going on? Have you heard about other funding? Have you heard about other things? Tell us about stuff, because we knew that gossip and anecdote were going to tell us as much about the funding opportunities as anything official, because there was so much confusion. That would help us succeed. That would help us survive. Just like the British. Bold, persistent, use your allies. So the Spanish fleet sailed north. It finally regrouped in the port of Gravelines. It was badly dispersed, badly damaged, badly worn, confused, but it managed to regroup in Gravelines. The British followed it, and finally, they determined that they could bring their guns to bear against the Spanish Armada, that they could take it on at Gravelines. Now, they didn't want to get close, because the second they got close, guess what? Yes, the Spanish would grapple and defeat them. So they stayed 100 yards away. No matter what happened, if the Spanish came towards them, they tacked away. They got out of there. They used the wind. The wind was helping them, and they used it. They used it to stay 100 yards from the Spanish and to shell the Spanish. And the British had superior gunmanship. They did. They had a much faster rate of fire. They could fire, fire, fire. The Spanish couldn't fire. It was very difficult on the Spanish ships because the Spanish ships were overloaded. The men couldn't maneuver around the guns because there were like horses on the ships and tents and food and clothing for the invasion, right? And they couldn't maneuver. And so the British rate of fire was much, much higher. Also, the British gun ports were much, much lower on the ship. So when they fired and the wind blew on the Spanish galleons, the cannonballs of the British would hit either below the waterline or at the rudder. They would do incredible damage. When I was a kid, my father's friend took us out on a sailboat. I was like 10 years old. And we were out on the bay, and he said, let's go look at the Golden Hind, that great old ship from exactly this period, an English ship. And we sailed right up next to it. It was so handsome. And we saw the gun ports. They were really low. He said, look how low the gun ports are. That's because the English like to shoot their cannonballs. They like the cannonball to skip along the waves and then slam into the bottom of the Armada, of the Spanish ships. And the wind always helped the British because it tilted those ships away from the cannonballs and they hit low. It was amazing. 5 Spanish galleons were sunk at Gravelines. Many others were damaged. It was an incredible blow to the Spanish Armada. There's some amazing paintings that came out of this battle. I love the artwork from this period, contemporary with the battle. Amazing. And here are the fleets intertwined. Look at that. With the British always staying 100 yards away. Their cannon could shoot across 100 yards, but they didn't want the Spanish getting closer because then they grapple and get them. So they always stayed 100 yards away. And my favorite, this painter, Cornelius Vroom. Amazing. He lived at the same time as the battle and he recorded it. Look at the delicacy of that. Isn't that a wonderful picture? When we went to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, I was so excited because I wanted to see the Rembrandts and the Vermeers and the Hals, but I also wanted to see the Vrooms, that great Dutch artist who captured the Spanish Armada's ordeal. I wanted to see the Vrooms. I was so excited to see the Vrooms, but where were they? I couldn't find them anywhere. Well, they weren't upstairs with the paintings. They were downstairs in the history section. So we went down there, but I still couldn't find it. And then I looked in a cabinet, a case, a glass case, which had all this kitschy stuff in it, like Spanish swords and cannonballs. It was just like junk. And there at the back of the case was this Vroom. I was like, wow, what disrespect. Come on, this guy's great. But he was just considered a history painter. But I've always loved his paintings. And anytime I hear of one, I make a pilgrimage to see them because he captured the Spanish Armada in such vivid detail. So Gravelines was a devastating defeat for the Spanish. And worse than anything, as they drifted away from the battlefield, not only was their fleet badly damaged, but they were drifting away from the army. Eventually, the army would return to Holland. It would never be loaded onto the ships. The Dutch went with them. And the war in Holland continued. Meanwhile, back in England, Queen Elizabeth was getting ready for an invasion. She didn't know about any of this. She still thought the invasion was coming, that army from Holland was going to be here soon. And she went out to meet her troops, who were woefully unprepared. There was one troop, one unit. Their weapons were bows and arrows, and they didn't even know how to fire them. It was pathetic. And if the 50,000 Spaniards had landed, they would have walked all over Elizabeth's troops, but she had to rally them. She had to do something, and this is all she had. And she made a famous speech at Tilbury. And she said, "By all valor in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over the enemies of my God, my kingdom, and my people." That's a real speech. And for me, it's even more wonderful than Shakespeare's "Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more." And of course, it inspired that speech. And the English victory inspired Shakespeare. So now the fleets were headed north. The Spanish were straggling. The wind was shoving the north, shoving the north. They wanted to get the army, but they couldn't pick it up because they were being shoved east, east, east. They thought they were going to go aground. So they steered away from the continent, away from the English Channel, and were let themselves be blown north. And the English pursued them for a while. The English fired after them. The English were out of everything. They had no more ammunition. They'd shot off everything at Gravelines. They'd fired their cannons for 8 hours. They'd run out of cannonballs, so they'd started firing anchor chains, nails, junk from the deck, anything. And now the Spanish Armada was being pushed north. And they pursued them as if they still had stuff. They were firing nothing at them. They were just psyching them out. Endlessly bold, endlessly persistent. The British knew how to scare the Spanish with the fire ships, with the gunfire at Gravelines, and with the pursuit. They kept getting pushed north, north, north. The whole armada was going north. And finally, the British broke off their pursuit in Scotland. Now, the British suffered too, because many British sailors contracted typhus and died. They turned back, but the Spanish Armada was too far north. Finally, Sidonia realized that he couldn't get back through the channel. It was now truly the English Channel. The British would get him if he went back that way. So he would have to go north all the way around the top of Scotland and return to Spain by going down the coast of Ireland around the way. And they came down. He came down and he was buffeted by storms. He was buffeted by storms. His sailors were not good enough. They weren't good enough to battle the storms. It was ruthless. The Gulf Stream was pushing against them. It kept pushing them up against the shore. There was nothing they could do. They couldn't seek shelter because so many of the ships had cut their anchors loose at Calais to escape the fire ships. They couldn't anchor anywhere, so they were driven onto the rocks. One of my favorite paintings is this one. Incredible. Vroom again, the Spanish Armada being driven onto the rocks. And look at there, beyond this ship. The waves almost look like monsters. They were. The waves and the wind were monsters to the Spanish. Look at that ship being driven onto the rocks. Look at the beauty. To imagine this beautiful ship is going to be destroyed. 5,000 Spanish sailors coming down the coast of Ireland, either drowned, starved to death, or were slaughtered when they tried to go ashore. Slaughtered by the Irish. It was a devastating defeat. And here it is. The world at kilter on its side. And there you see the Spanish ships going down the coast of Ireland, sinking, sinking, sinking. It was a horrifying defeat for the Spanish. Philip never thought it would happen. He didn't think it was possible. And when the Spanish fleet finally stumbled back into Spain, only half of the fleet was left. One half of the fleet, less than 10,000 men, 30,000 had set out, 150 ships, 75 returned, less than 10,000 men survived. It was a complete and utter defeat for a man who was not used to losing, a superpower. His armada destroyed. He said, Philip II, he said, I sent my armada to fight against men, not against God's wind and waves. He was a pious man, fanatically so. And he thought that God had betrayed him. His Catholic God had betrayed him. The English called it the Protestant Wind. That's what they saw, the Protestant Wind. And a coin was struck to celebrate the victory of the English fleet over the Spanish Armada. And on the coin was written, Jehovah sent his winds, and they were scattered. It truly was, in their view, the triumph of Protestants over the Catholics. What were the technological advances of all this? What had they learned? The English had learned that their guess about tactics was correct. Ships should be sleek. They should be built for combat. Gunnery was important, and seamanship, and that was what would make the Royal Navy the power of all the seas. Up till then, Spain had been dominant, but now it would be England. And England with its Royal Navy would conquer the world in the place of Spain. The war would continue until 1604. There'd be two more Spanish armadas, two more attempts to invade England, and an English armada, a counter armada sent against Spain. None of them would succeed. The storms always turned against whoever was invading. But the British had set a pattern, and they emerged a superpower from this fight. Eventually, they nudged the Portuguese and the Spanish out of India and set up the East India Company to exploit India, another land that they would exploit. And then they started to colonize the United States, setting up a province shortly after this called Virginia, named after Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. And what did we learn? We learned to be bold, to stay in the fight, to persist, to always keep looking for opportunities, to not get stuck like the Spanish in some plan, some old plan about what live theater was supposed to be, to keep hammering away at things, to stay in the fight. Theater announcers is still here. I don't know. Feels like anything could happen. That's COVID-19. It wasn't just during the day that we would go to that beautiful conservatory of flowers. We started going at night because they did a wonderful thing. At night, they lit it up, hippie style, and they played music. And one night I went and I was sure to put on my mask. And I sat up there with a few other people, keeping my distance, and they were playing music. And I just was in front of that beautiful conservatory, lit up with those incredible lights, and I just danced. I thought about all the disasters that have befallen this world during COVID-19, and all the challenges that lay ahead, even some people who I knew who had suffered grievously in all this. I thought, wow, how we can get through it? Well, somehow we just have to take a break once in a while. Stop worrying about performing, keeping things going. Stop worrying about tomorrow. Sometimes we just have to look at the lights and dance. Thank you for joining me. This has been COVID Adventure. I'm John Fisher. It was terrific performing for you tonight. This story of the Spanish Armada and also our own drama, COVID-19. This is my 51st solo performance as part of the Essential Services Project. It started the week after that show closed. That show still hasn't reopened, but Theater Rhinoceros has been very busy. We have the ESP on Thursday nights. I'll be back next week with a piece called Jenny, about a friend of mine from high school. And also we have a benefit performance coming up on April 2nd, which should be really exciting, called Pandemic Performances, with some great talent. We have a reading coming up in April as well. So a lot of exciting stuff at Theater Rhinoceros. And in May, we have Mark Nadler, who will be creating a show specifically for the Rhino audience. So check that out. You can find out about all these things on our website, therhino.org. That's THERHINO.org. People have been incredibly supportive during COVID-19, and it's kept Theater Rhinoceros going. If you'd like to support all these free programs that we've been doing, we'd certainly appreciate it. You can do so by sending a check to me, John Fisher, at my COVID-19 office. John Fisher, Theater Rhinoceros, 91 Central Avenue, number 102, San Francisco, California, 94117, or go on the website, therhino.org, THERHINO.org, and you can make a donation there by clicking on donate through PayPal. And more than anything, thank you so much for being with me tonight. And I've always loved the Spanish Armada. I've loved the legacy of where I live, the indigenous peoples, the Anglo legacy, the Spanish legacy, Mexican, everything. And I recognize that there is complexities there. You have to unpack those complexities, see how things happen. Maybe then we can avoid these things, these dumb political things, because God knows nature is going to visit stuff like COVID-19 on us. We don't have to add to the problems of the world with our methods. But more than anything, thank you for being with me tonight. If you ever get a notion, I don't know, just dance. Good night.